Why Hitler Really Lost World War I, full documentary Chapter I, The Illusion of Invincibility. The story of Hitler's defeat does not begin in 1945, when the Red Army stormed Berlin, nor in 1944 with the collapse of the Eastern Front. It begins earlier, at the height of Hitler's power, when the Third Reich appeared unstoppable. In 1940, Europe had fallen with unprecedented speed. Poland collapsed in weeks, Denmark and Norway in days. France, a major military power with one of the largest armies in Europe, disintegrated in 6 weeks. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, became a global sensation, and Germany looked like a nation destined to reshape the world. But beneath the triumphs, cracks were already forming. These cracks would widen with every victory, every bold move, and every strategic gamble. The seeds of Germany's defeat were planted not by its enemies, but by its own leadership, its ideology, and its fatal miscalculations. In 1940, few could imagine the Third Reich losing the war. Hitler, at the peak of his political and military confidence, believed Germany was guided by destiny. His generals, many of whom quietly doubted the long-term viability of his plans, were sidelined. The German population, intoxicated by victory, embraced the narrative of invincibility. This illusion of unstoppable power would become one of the most destructive elements in Germany's strategic trajectory. The leadership made decisions not on the basis of military logic but on ideology, emotion, and overconfidence. The question of why Hitler lost World War I can only be answered by traveling back to these early moments, when Germany believed it could not lose. Chapter I, Flawed Leadership at the Core. No modern conflict illustrates the importance of leadership more than the Second World War. At the center of every German decision stood one man, Adolf Hitler. His rise to absolute authority within the Nazi state meant that strategic decision-making became centralized, rigid, and deeply biased. Hitler was not a trained military strategist, despite his belief in his own genius. He rejected advice from experienced generals, punished dissent, and increasingly made decisions based on instinct rather than intelligence. By 1941, Hitler was personally dictating operational details down to the divisional level, a level of micromanagement that suffocated Germany's military flexibility. His style of command relied on the belief that willpower could overcome logistics, geography, and numerical disadvantage. This worldview clashed with the reality of modern industrial warfare. Hitler also created an environment where bad news was suppressed. Intelligence officers feared his reaction, and commanders softened their assessments to avoid punishment. This created a culture of delusion inside the German high command. When the Eastern Front began to break, Hitler refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. He fired generals, replaced them with loyalists, and demanded no retreat orders that turned manageable withdrawals into catastrophic encirclements. Leadership is the nervous system of war. When the center is dysfunctional, the entire structure collapses, no matter how strong the military beneath it. Hitler's leadership did not simply weaken Germany. It ensured Germany could not win a long, global war. Chapter E, The strategic overstretch. Germany triumphed in short, localized conflicts. The Wehrmacht was optimized for fast, decisive operations, not long, grinding wars of attrition. Blitzkrieg required speed, mobility, and concentration of force. It was brilliant when used against isolated enemies who were unprepared for this style of combat. But success misled German leadership. Victories in Poland and France convinced Hitler that Blitzkrieg could work everywhere. Against anyone, under any circumstances. The reality was very different. Germany lacked the industrial capacity, manpower reserve, and logistical infrastructure to fight prolonged multi-front warfare. When Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, Germany was already engaged in a monumental struggle against the Soviet Union. The decision effectively turned the war into a global conflict Germany could not possibly win. The United States, with its overwhelming industrial potential, would soon outproduce all Axis powers combined. Germany's factories, limited in resources and operating under constant Allied bombing, could not keep pace. By 1942, Germany was overstretched on an almost absurd scale, fighting in North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Arctic, the Balkans, and the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. Supplies were insufficient, reinforcements too slow, and fuel scarce. The Wehrmacht was constantly forced to shift units from one front to another, weakening its ability to sustain offensive operations. Strategic overstretch was not a sudden collapse. It was a gradual tightening of a noose. A news Germany had crafted itself through ambition unchecked by reality. Chapter of Operation Barbarossa. The fatal gamble. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union, accompanied by hundreds of thousands of Axis allies. Hitler believed the USSR would collapse within months. He described it as a colossus with feet of clay, weakened by purges, political terror, and economic mismanagement. Early victories seemed to confirm his beliefs. Soviet armies disintegrated, millions were captured, enormous territories fell under German control. But these successes masked three critical miscalculations. First, the vastness of the Soviet Union was unlike any battlefield Germany had previously faced. Distances strained supply lines to breaking point. Roads were primitive, bridges unreliable, and railways incompatible with German standards. The Wehrmacht was forced to rely on horses, an image that contradicted the myth of a fully mechanized army. Second, Hitler underestimated Soviet resilience. Despite catastrophic losses, new Soviet armies were raised, reorganized, and deployed with astonishing speed. The Soviet population was willing to endure unimaginable hardship. The industrial relocation to the east, beyond the Ural Mountains, ensured continuous production of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Third, German ideology blinded military judgment. Hitler refused to prioritize key objectives. He shifted focus repeatedly between Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine, preventing the Wehrmacht from achieving decisive victory in any sector. By December 1941, with winter closing in and the Red Army launching a massive counteroffensive, the German advance stalled. The myth of blitzkrieg ended in the snow before Moscow. Operation Barbarossa was not simply a failed campaign. It was the moment Germany lost the war, long before most people realized it. Chapter V. The winter that broke the myth. The winter of 19,411,942 became one of the defining moments of the Eastern Front. German soldiers, who were promised a swift victory and a quick return home, now endured temperatures dropping to 40 degrees. Equipment failed, lubricants froze, weapons jammed, engines refused to start, medical supplies ran out. Uniforms designed for a European autumn offered no protection against the Russian winter. The German High Command had not prepared for winter warfare, because Hitler believed the campaign would be over long before winter arrived. For this reason, critical winter gear remained stocked in warehouses back in Poland. When the cold arrived, supply lines were too overstretched to deliver them. As frostbite spread and exhaustion increased, the Wehrmacht discovered an enemy far more relentless than anticipated: the Russian climate. Meanwhile, the Red Army, better equipped and more accustomed to winter conditions, launched a series of counteroffensives around Moscow. Siberian divisions, hardened by extreme conditions and freshly transferred from the east after Japan decided not to attack the Soviet Union, struck the Germans with overwhelming force. The Wehrmacht, already stretched thin, began to retreat for the first time. This moment shattered the psychological confidence of the German military and the myth of invincibility that had shaped Hitler's early victories. The German leadership tried to portray the retreat as temporary, but for many frontline soldiers, it was clear. The war in the East had transformed from a rapid campaign into a brutal war of attrition. Germany was now fighting a type of war it was never designed to win. Chapter VI. Hitler's ideology versus military logic. Behind many of Germany's most disastrous decisions stood not military strategy but ideology. Hitler's worldview was grounded in racial superiority, destiny, and the belief that willpower alone could overcome material disadvantage. This ideology often clashed with the realities on the battlefield. Hitler considered the Slavic peoples inferior and believed the Soviet Union could not sustain modern warfare. This caused him to underestimate Soviet industrial capacity, manpower, and strategic depth. The result was a series of operations that ignored logistical fundamentals. German troops were ordered to advance far beyond their supply capabilities. Rear security was neglected. Local populations who might have initially supported Germany were alienated by brutal occupation policies. Hitler's racial worldview also influenced Germany's resource allocation. The Holocaust, the forced deportations, and the exploitation of occupied territories required vast numbers of troops, trains, administration, and logistical support. While the Red Army focused on production and mobilization, Germany diverted manpower and transportation networks into maintaining a massive system of repression and mass murder. This consumed resources that could have significantly strengthened the Eastern Front. Within the military hierarchy, Hitler increasingly viewed professional generals with suspicion. Commanders who suggested retreats or defensive operations were dismissed or sidelined. Their replacements often lacked experience but were loyal. In this environment, the best military minds were suppressed, and critical advice was ignored. Germany was fighting a global industrial war with the strategic philosophy of a dictator. Convinced of his own infallibility, ideology had become a weapon, not against Germany's enemies, but against Germany itself. Chapter V. The failed capture of Moscow. Moscow was not only the political heart of the Soviet Union, but also a central hub of its transportation and communication networks. Capturing the city would have delivered a devastating blow to Soviet morale and potentially disrupted the coordination of Soviet forces. For this reason, many German generals, including Heinz Guderian and Fedor von Bock, insisted on a direct advance toward Moscow in the summer of 1941. Hitler disagreed. Instead of prioritizing Moscow, he shifted forces south toward Ukraine and north toward Leningrad. These decisions delayed the offensive toward Moscow until autumn, when the rainy season turned roads into mud and slowed the German advance. By the time Operation Typhoon, the offensive against Moscow, began in October, the Wehrmacht had already lost its momentum. The Germans advanced to within sight of Moscow's suburbs, but by then, the weather, exhaustion, and logistical failures made further progress impossible. Reinforcements never arrived. Food and ammunition were scarce. Panzer divisions, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, now had only a fraction of their original tanks operational. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, gathered reserves, fortified defensive lines, and prepared counterattacks. When winter arrived, the German advance froze, both literally and figuratively. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back dozens of kilometers. Hitler responded by ordering his infamous Stand Fast directive, forbidding any retreat. This transformed manageable withdrawals into near disasters. The failure to capture Moscow was not merely a missed opportunity. It marked a strategic turning point. Blitzkrieg had failed. The war had become one of endurance, and in such a war, the Soviet Union possessed overwhelming advantages. Chapter V. The United States enters the war on December 7, 1941. Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States, a decision widely considered one of the most catastrophic in military history. No treaty required Germany to do so. Japan had not asked for assistance. Hitler made the decision based on ideological alignment, overconfidence, and a belief that the United States was militarily weak. He was disastrously wrong. The United States possessed vast natural resources, an enormous industrial base, and a population ready to support wartime mobilization. Within months, American factories began producing tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition on a scale unmatched in human history. The United States quickly became the arsenal of democracy, supplying not only its own forces but also the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom. Through the Lend-Lease program, American industrial output dwarfed that of Germany. By 1944, the United States was producing more planes in a single year than Germany produced during the entire war. Shipyards built aircraft carriers, battleships, and destroyers at unprecedented speed. Liberty ships, essential for transporting supplies to Allied forces, were being built in as little as 4 days. Germany, already strained by the Eastern Front and limited access to fuel and raw materials, could not compete. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States ensured that Germany now faced a global coalition with unlimited industrial capacity. The entrance of the United States transformed World War I from a regional conflict into a true global war, one that Germany had no chance of winning. Chapter X. The Battle of Stalingrad. The turning point of the war. Stalingrad was not chosen for strategic reasons alone. It carried the name of Joseph Stalin, and for Hitler, that made it a political prize. The city sat along the Volga River, controlling access to the Caucasus oil fields, resources Germany desperately needed. But more than its industrial value, Stalingrad represented an opportunity for Hitler to break Soviet morale and achieve a symbolic victory. The battle began in the summer of 1942 and quickly devolved into one of the bloodiest confrontations in human history. The Luftwaffe reduced much of the city to rubble, but the ruins offered ideal defensive positions for Soviet troops. Every building, basement, and staircase became a battleground. The Germans advanced slowly, paying for each block with hundreds of lives. Hitler, obsessed with capturing the city, refused to allow withdrawals or tactical regrouping. As winter approached, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus found itself overstretched and exhausted. Soviet forces, using staged withdrawals and strategic deception, prepared a massive encirclement known as Operation Uranus. In November 1942, they struck. The German Sixth Army was trapped. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold the city to the last man, promising that supplies would be flown in by air. But the Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Hunger, frostbite, and disease spread rapidly. Attempts to break the encirclement failed. By February 1943, the Sixth Army surrendered, the first time an entire German field army had capitulated. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German military superiority and lifted Soviet morale. It marked the beginning of a relentless Soviet advance westward and the end of any realistic hope for a German victory in the East. The psychological impact was enormous. The world saw that the Wehrmacht could be stopped, defeated, and destroyed. Chapter X: The Collapse in North Africa. While Stalingrad raged, another disaster unfolded thousands of kilometers away in North Africa. Initially, the Afrika Korps under General Owen Rommel achieved impressive victories. Rommel's bold tactics and rapid maneuvers became legendary, but his success masked severe logistical problems. Supplies had to be transported across the Mediterranean, where Allied naval and air forces increasingly dominated. Fuel shortages plagued every operation. In October 1942, the British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery launched the Second Battle of El Alamein. This marked a decisive shift in the campaign. The Allies had superior numbers, better supply lines, and growing air dominance. Rommel's forces fought fiercely but were gradually pushed back. Hitler ordered Rommel to hold positions long after retreat was the logical option, repeating the same mistakes made on the Eastern Front. By May 1943, German and Italian forces in North Africa were trapped in Tunisia. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, a loss comparable to Stalingrad. The Mediterranean now belonged to the Allies, opening the way for invasions of Sicily and mainland Italy. The North African collapse was not simply a defeat in an isolated theater. It weakened Axis influence, drained resources, and demonstrated once again that Germany's reach had exceeded its capabilities. It was another nail in the coffin of Hitler's war effort. Chapter X: The Allied Strategic Bombing Campaign. As Germany struggled on multiple fronts, the Allies intensified their strategic bombing campaign. Factories, shipyards, oil refineries, and transportation networks became primary targets. The bombing was relentless. Industrial cities such as Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen suffered devastating damage. The firebombing of Hamburg in 1943 created a firestorm that killed tens of thousands and crippled one of Germany's most important industrial centers. Germany attempted to disperse production, move factories underground, and rebuild damaged facilities. But the bombing forced constant relocation, disrupted supply chains, and destroyed critical infrastructure. Skilled workers were killed or displaced. Railroads and highways were repeatedly bombed, slowing troop movements and delaying essential supplies to the front lines. Even more devastating were the attacks on Germany's oil production. Synthetic fuel plants, refineries, and storage facilities were targeted relentlessly. By 1944, Germany faced a crippling fuel shortage. Tanks sat idle. Aircraft could not fly. Training programs were cut. The German military machine, once renowned for its mobility and precision, became increasingly paralyzed. Strategic bombing did not win the war by itself, but it intensified every other strain on the German war effort. When combined with the Eastern Front and the Mediterranean campaigns, the pressure became overwhelming. The Reich was slowly being suffocated from the air. Chapter G: The Battle of Kursk. The last German offensive in the East. In July 1943, Germany launched Operation Citadel, an attempt to cut off a massive Soviet salient around the city of Kursk. Hitler hoped to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front after the disaster at Stalingrad. Kursk would become the largest tank battle in history. By this time, however, the balance of power had shifted. The Soviets, armed with extensive intelligence from multiple sources, including the British, knew exactly when and where the attack would come. They prepared deeply layered defenses, minefields, anti-tank positions, trenches, artillery traps, and fortified lines stretching hundreds of kilometers. When the Germans attacked, they faced an enemy ready for every move. The Tiger and Panther tanks, although powerful, were plagued by mechanical issues and insufficient numbers. The Soviets fielded swarms of T-34s supported by artillery and air superiority. As the fighting intensified, the German advance slowed to a crawl. After days of heavy losses, Hitler called off the offensive due to the Allied invasion of Sicily. The sudden halt turned a costly attack into a strategic defeat. The Soviets immediately counterattacked, pushing the Germans back and beginning a series of offensives that would ultimately recapture most of the lost territory. Kursk marked the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive war against a rapidly advancing Red Army. Germany had lost the ability to dictate the pace or direction of the conflict. Chapters I, Italy falls and the Mediterranean crumbles in July 1943. As the Battle of Kursk raged in the east, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. The operation combined naval power, airborne assaults, and ground forces in a coordinated attack that the Axis could not repel. German and Italian troops fought hard but lacked reinforcements and air cover. Within weeks, Sicily fell, and the Allies gained a crucial foothold in Europe. The defeat caused panic within the Italian government. Benito Mussolini, once one of Hitler's closest allies, was arrested after a vote of no confidence by his own Grand Council. Italy signed an armistice with the Allies soon after. Hitler reacted with fury. He ordered German forces to occupy Italy, disarm Italian troops, and rescue Mussolini in a daring commando raid led by Otto Skorzeny. But Germany could not save Italy from collapse. The Allies advanced steadily through the Italian peninsula, supported by overwhelming air superiority and vast naval resources. The German army fought tenaciously, defending positions such as the Gustav Line and the monastery at Monte Cassino. But every defensive victory delayed the inevitable. Italy had become a second European front, a draining, mountainous, brutal campaign that consumed German manpower and resources. The fall of Italy marked another strategic disaster for Hitler. It opened the Mediterranean for Allied operations, forced Germany to stretch its defenses even further, and shattered the Axis coalition. Germany was increasingly isolated, facing overwhelming enemies on all sides. Chapter Sheaves, the Eastern Front collapses by late 1943 and early 1944. The Eastern Front had shifted dramatically in favor of the Soviet Union. The Red Army, rebuilt and rearmed with massive quantities of tanks, artillery, aircraft, and supplies, much of it provided through Lend-Lease, began a series of devastating offensives. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, became the most catastrophic defeat in German military history. Over 120 German divisions were destroyed, nearly the entire army group center collapsed, and the Soviets advanced hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks. German command structures fell apart. Entire formations were surrounded, overrun, or annihilated. The once feared Wehrmacht was now in full retreat. The scale of the Soviet advance stunned even the Allies. Town after town, city after city was liberated. The Germans could no longer form stable defensive lines. For the first time, the Red Army entered territories that had been part of the Reich for centuries. Panic spread across East Prussia as refugees fled westward, desperate to escape the advancing front line. The Eastern Front had become a one-way march toward Berlin. Hitler issued orders for counterattacks that were impossible to carry out, demanded defenses that could not be held, and refused to allow strategic withdrawals. The result was unnecessary losses and the continued erosion of Germany's already exhausted forces. Chapters: D-Day and the opening of the Western Front on June 6, 1944. The Allies launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. More than 150,000 troops from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and multiple allied nations landed on the beaches of Normandy. The invasion opened the long-awaited Western Front, creating a two-front war that Germany was never designed to withstand. Although German defenses inflicted heavy casualties on some beaches, particularly Omaha, the Allies pushed forward with overwhelming strength. Air supremacy gave them a decisive advantage. Allied aircraft destroyed bridges, cut supply lines, and prevented German reinforcements from reaching Normandy quickly. Tanks, artillery, and infantry poured ashore in numbers Germany could not match. Hitler made crucial strategic errors. He hesitated to release panzer reserves, believing the main invasion might come elsewhere. His commanders disagreed on how to use armored forces effectively. By the time the German high command reacted, the Allies had established a secure beachhead and were pushing inland. The breakout from Normandy, particularly Operation Cobra, shattered German defenses. Paris was liberated in August 1944, and the Allies began advancing rapidly toward the German border. The Western Front had truly opened, and Germany was now being crushed from both east and west. The fear of a two-front war had haunted Germany since the First World War. In 1944, that nightmare became reality once again. Chapters V. The failure of the Ardennes Offensive in a last desperate attempt to reverse the course of the war. Hitler launched the Ardennes Offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944. The plan was audacious: break through the lightly defended Ardennes forest, split Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate. At first, the surprise worked. Snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft, and German units advanced rapidly. But the offensive soon stalled. Fuel shortages crippled German mobility. The terrain was difficult. American defensive pockets, such as at Bastogne, held out with extraordinary resilience. Once the weather cleared, Allied air power devastated German positions. The offensive consumed Germany's last reserves of manpower, tanks, and fuel. When it failed, the Wehrmacht had nothing left to launch another major attack. It was a final, futile gamble that accelerated the collapse of the Western Front. The defeat in the Ardennes made it clear. The war was lost. The only question now was how long Germany would continue to fight. Chapters V. The final collapse of the Third Reich. By early 1945, Germany was in ruins. Allied bombers dominated the skies. The Eastern Front had broken wide open, with Soviet forces advancing swiftly toward Berlin. The Western Allies crossed the Rhine and moved deep into German territory. Major cities were devastated by bombing, infrastructure had crumbled, and civilian suffering reached unimaginable levels. Hitler refused to surrender. He retreated into the Fuhrer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Cut off from the outside world and increasingly delusional, he issued orders to imaginary armies, demanded counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed, and blamed everyone except himself for the disaster he had created. The Soviets launched their final assault on Berlin in April 1945. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army fought its way into the capital. German resistance, though fierce, was hopeless. On April 30th, with Soviet troops just blocks away, Hitler took his own life. Berlin surrendered soon after. On May 7, 1945, Germany unconditionally capitulated. The war in Europe was over. Chapters V. The role of intelligence and technological inferiority. As the war progressed, intelligence and technology became decisive factors shaping its outcome. Germany entered the conflict with excellent tactical innovation, but over time, it fell behind in several crucial areas. Allied intelligence services, especially the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, achieved breakthroughs that fundamentally altered the war. The cracking of the Enigma code allowed the Allies to read vast quantities of German military communications. Submarine movements, convoy routes, and even high-level strategic decisions were often known in advance. This intelligence advantage reduced the effectiveness of the German U-boat fleet, once a major threat to Allied shipping, and undermined German plans on multiple fronts. At the same time, Allied radar, sonar, and aircraft detection technologies advanced rapidly. Germany, constrained by limited industrial resources and competing priorities, could not keep pace. Hitler invested heavily in wonder weapons such as the V-1 and V-2 rockets, believing they could reverse the course of the war. Although technologically impressive, these weapons consumed enormous resources and delivered little strategic value. They caused terror, but did not impact the outcome of major campaigns. Meanwhile, the United States and the Soviet Union made sweeping advancements in tank production, aircraft design, and artillery systems. The Soviet T-34 became one of the most effective tanks of the war due to its simplicity, armor, and mobility. American aircraft like the P-51 Mustang secured their superiority over Europe. Germany produced excellent weapons, such as the Tiger tank and the Me-262 jet fighter, but often in too few numbers, too late, and at too high a cost. Technological inferiority was not the cause of Germany's defeat, but it amplified every other weakness. In a war of production, logistics, and global coordination, Germany's inability to innovate efficiently or outproduce its enemies sealed its fate. Chapter 6. Hitler's strategic blindness. The deeper the war progressed, the more detached from reality Hitler became. His strategic worldview narrowed, his decisions grew more erratic, and his refusal to adapt ensured Germany's destruction. He repeatedly ignored military intelligence, dismissed strategic analysis, and replaced experienced commanders with loyalists. His insistence on holding territory at any cost led to catastrophic encirclements and losses. Instead of conserving his forces and trading space for time, Hitler forced his armies into rigid defensive positions. Every retreat was seen as betrayal. Every failure was blamed on imagined conspiracies. As a result, even when German generals devised workable strategies, Hitler's interference rendered them ineffective. Hitler also underestimated the psychological and economic resilience of both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. He believed the United States was a divided nation incapable of sustained warfare. He believed the Soviet Union would collapse under its own weight, and he believed Britain would eventually seek peace after the fall of France. All his assumptions were wrong. His refusal to accept reality, coupled with ideological fanaticism, transformed Germany's war effort from desperate to doomed. Strategic blindness was not just a flaw in leadership. It was the central force driving Germany toward inevitable defeat. Chapter XX. The war Germany could never win in the end. Germany lost World War II because it was fighting a war it could never win. Even with flawless leadership, even without catastrophic decisions, even with perfect execution, the fundamental balance of power was against Germany from the beginning. The United States possessed unmatched industrial might. The Soviet Union possessed massive manpower and strategic depth. Britain controlled global sea lanes and held together a worldwide coalition. Germany, smaller in population and resources, attempted to dominate all of Europe and defeat three global powers simultaneously. The war Germany wanted, a series of rapid campaigns against isolated enemies, was not the war it faced. Instead, it became a clash of empires, industries, and ideologies. Once the conflict expanded beyond blitzkrieg into a prolonged war of attrition, Germany was destined to lose. Chapter XE. The final legacy. When Berlin fell and the Third Reich collapsed, Europe lay in ruins. Tens of millions had died. Entire cities were destroyed. The Holocaust had revealed the darkest depths of human cruelty. The war transformed global politics, redrew borders, and reshaped the world order for generations to come. Germany's defeat became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of ideology, totalitarianism, and unchecked ambition. The legacy of the war extends far beyond battles and front lines. It is a story of human endurance, sacrifice, and the staggering cost of tyranny. Understanding why Hitler lost World War II is more than an academic exercise. It is a warning. It shows how a modern nation, driven by fanaticism and led by a single delusional dictator, can lead itself to destruction and drag the world into catastrophe. Conclusion. Why Hitler lost World War II not because of a single mistake, but because of a combination of fatal flaws. Flawed leadership rooted in ideology, strategic overstretch and impossible ambitions, underestimating the Soviet Union, declaring war on the United States, mismanaging resources and logistics, failing to adapt to a global industrial conflict, suppressing intelligence, dissent, and military expertise, refusing to retreat or maneuver strategically, overwhelming Allied industrial and manpower superiority. Germany did not simply lose on the battlefield, it lost in planning, in strategy, in leadership, and in ideology. World War II did not end with a single battle, but with the collapse of a system that could never achieve the victory it sought. Hitler's defeat was inevitable, and the world is shaped today by the consequences of that failure.